At 11 a.m. on the 3rd of September 1939, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced that a state of war existed between Germany and Great Britain. That evening, the Donaldson liner SS Athenia sailed 250 miles northwest of the Irish coast on her normal routine passage from Glasgow to Montreal. She was carrying 1,103 passengers and a crew of 305. Amongst her passengers were 300 Americans, as well as over 100 children. At 7:30 p.m., her port side exploded. Athenia immediately listed to port and began to settle by the stern. Although she remained afloat for several hours before she finally sank, 118 passengers and crew were killed, including 28 Americans. The Athenia had been sunk by a U-30 commanded by Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp. It was an unprecedented act of naval aggression. The Battle of the Atlantic and the war against the U-boats had begun. From the Middle Ages, Britain depended on overseas trade for her wealth and prosperity. She established and expanded an overseas empire whose role was to supply raw materials and act as a market for British manufactured goods. But Britain had become more and more vulnerable to interruptions to that trade. Almost half the world's ocean-going merchant shipping flew the Red Ensign. British shipyards built 40% of the world's merchant ships, and the Royal Navy made protecting Britain's trade vessels one of its top priorities. Needless to say, Britain's enemies recognized that interrupting her trade would have disastrous consequences. Between 1914 and 1918, Germany pursued a submarine campaign against the United Kingdom that nearly brought Britain to her knees. In April 1917, the Germans sank almost 900,000 tons of Allied shipping, virtually all of which was by submarine. It was a catastrophic loss, reducing the British stock of essential war supplies down to a mere 6 weeks. Yet the submarines involved were small, fragile, and unreliable. The first German submarine, the U-1, had only been completed at the end of 1906, and the first operational U-boat, armed with a single torpedo tube, had managed to complete a 600-mile cruise around German waters in 1908. To the British, the idea of a submarine was looked on as ignoble and underhand. In 1914, Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, dismissed the possibility of a submarine campaign targeting Britain's trade. "I do not believe that this would ever be undertaken by a civilized power," he said. Lusitania was on a normal liner voyage from New York to Liverpool when, as she approached Queenstown on the Irish coast, she was hit by a torpedo fired from a U-20. She sank rapidly, taking almost 2,000 passengers with her, most of whom were women and children. Over 100 were Americans. The Germans quickly tried to justify the act by claiming that the Lusitania was carrying war supplies. Although there was a shred of truth to such claims, the loss of so much innocent life could not be justified. The loss of the Lusitania raised the curtain on unrestricted submarine warfare. All enemy vessels became legitimate targets and could be attacked without warning. Gradually, the British Admiralty began to realize that the submarine could completely change maritime warfare. German submarines started to seriously weaken British and Allied shipping, and the defenders had little with which to fight back. Tactics like Q-ships, where warships were disguised as merchant ships, simply forced the German submarines to attack while still submerged. Only the reluctant introduction of the convoy system late in the war led to a decline in the numbers of lost merchant ships. By the end of the First World War, almost 5,000 British merchant ships were sunk by submarines. Nearly 15,500 merchant sailors were lost. At the same time, 178 German submarines were sunk, killing over 6,000 German sailors. But they had brought Britain perilously close to defeat. It was a salutary lesson on the potential of the submarine as a devastating weapon. This lesson was lost neither on the British nor on those surviving German naval officers who would later spearhead the naval forces in the Second World War. The Treaty of Versailles placed strict limits on the size and the composition of the German armed forces. One of these limits imposed a total ban on the construction or operation of submarines. But Germany had entered the First World War as submarine novices and emerged from it as experts. Small as it was, the German Navy was not about to throw away its huge advantage in an area of warfare that would prove critical in any future conflict. The result was a remarkable conspiracy by German naval officers and shipbuilders, in which a web of intrigue was created to mask the fact that Germany was determined to build on its expertise in submarine warfare. As early as 1920, a new underwater warfare section was established within the Torpedo and Mines Inspectorate at Kiel. At the same time, German shipbuilders could still offer help and advice to countries such as Japan, Argentina, Italy, and Sweden. This ingenious plan ensured that German skills were not lost and were kept up to date with new technological developments. Germany even tried to establish submarine building yards in Holland and Spain. These plans were soon shelved, though, after pressure from the international community. Other complicated cover organizations were established to make it virtually impossible for Allied monitors, set up under the League of Nations, to keep accurate records of what the Germans were really up to. By the early 1930s, German-designed submarines were under construction in Holland, Spain, Estonia, and Finland for a variety of customers. Strangely enough, every submarine looked remarkably similar to the most successful German U-boat designs of the First World War. When Adolf Hitler took power in 1932, rearmament took on a new importance. Hitler was determined to remove the restrictions that had been imposed at Versailles as soon as he could, by legal means or not. By the autumn of 1933, an official submarine school was established at Kiel, and 80 officers were hand-picked to become its first students. At the same time, U-boat parts and sections began to be imported into Germany from the German-sponsored submarine yards in Holland. By 1935, Hitler was proposing a new German navy that was to include a submarine force nearly half the size of that of Great Britain. Unfortunately, by this time the restrictions imposed by Versailles and other naval treaties had been flouted by almost all the signatories, leaving Britain with little choice but to accept the new German proposals. The world, however, was somewhat surprised to find that Germany was starting to commission brand new submarines only 4 months after she had agreed to relax the limitations. But it was too late. By September 1939, Germany boasted 57 U-boats. Traditionally, Britain's ports had specific roles. On the east coast, Hull was the main trading port for Northern Europe, Scandinavia, and the Baltic. Newcastle was a coal-exporting port, and London was the most important port for the imperial trade with East Africa and the Far East, with the ships of the British India Line, the Orient Line, and P&O largely based there. Southampton on the south coast was mainly a passenger port for services to North America. The great Cunard White Star liners, including the Queen Mary, Aquitania, Mauretania, and the almost complete Queen Elizabeth, started their record-breaking voyages from the port. On the west coast, the major ports for North America were Liverpool and Birkenhead. Manchester was home to Cunard's cargo operation and the company's Port Line, Harrison Line and the Blue Star Line. Trade with South America was conducted via the Bristol Channel ports. With war looming on the horizon, this pattern of trade had to change. A shift took place away from the more vulnerable ports of the south and east towards the ports of the west and north that were further from the enemy. Similarly, the traditional naval bases of Plymouth, Portsmouth and Chatham were just too close to Germany. So the escorts followed the merchant ships to the north and west, with the major units moving to bases in Scotland. To have a serious effect on Britain's trade with her empire and with her North American partners, the U-boats would have to operate in the western approaches, either north of Ireland into the Clyde or through St George's Channel into the Irish Sea and Liverpool. These waters had proved rich grounds for the U-boats of the Kaiser's navy, and the first successes of the German submarines had been achieved west of Ireland. It would be some time before U-boats in sufficient numbers were available to take the war further afield. It would also be in this region that the Royal Navy initially deployed its meagre anti-submarine forces.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
The Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy through most of the Battle of the Atlantic was Admiral of the Fleet Sir Dudley Pound. As First Sea Lord, he was responsible for all the operational and administrative aspects of the British Navy. He was appointed to the job at the age of 62 in June 1939, having been Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean. In some respects, though, he was an odd choice. He suffered from arthritis in his left leg that disturbed his sleep and gave him a pronounced limp. Although this disability never affected his judgment, it did account for certain aspects of his personality. He lacked humor, had no interests outside his work, and he found delegation difficult. Some of his colleagues believed him to be a pressure cooker, barely under control. But his long experience as a naval officer that included the Battle of Jutland and a first-class brain enabled him to cope with the stresses and strains of working with Winston Churchill. He had the courage to resist some of Churchill's wilder naval schemes, helping the war effort considerably. Once he was left in peace to conduct a purely naval operation from the Admiralty, Pound showed sound personal judgment and a readiness to take responsibility for fateful decisions. He was correct more often than he was proved wrong. Certainly no one could criticize Pound's devotion to his duty and the cause for which he was fighting. Admiral Sir Max Houghton is the British naval officer whose name is most synonymous with the victory of the Battle of the Atlantic. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches on the 19th of November 1942 and bore that responsibility until the end of the war. Houghton was the third officer to hold the post. The first had been a hero of the First World War, Admiral Sir Martin Dunbar Naismith, who had earned the Victoria Cross for his exploits as a submarine commander in the Mediterranean. Dunbar Naismith's problems had been huge, and he should take the credit for establishing the first escort groups and a training regime to enable escort crews to approach their task in the most professional manner possible. He formed a tactical training school at Liverpool for escort officers and a work-up facility at Tobermory on the Isle of Mull, where ships could practice their tactics under the watchful eye of the notorious Vice Admiral Gilbert Stevenson, the terror of Tobermory. Dunbar Naismith was also responsible for the relocation of the Western Approaches HQ from Plymouth to Derby House in Liverpool, where it was much closer to the heart of the battle. It was shortly after this move, on the 17th of February 1941, that he was relieved as Commander-in-Chief by Admiral Sir Percy Noble. Dunbar Naismith remained as Commander-in-Chief of the Plymouth Command. Admiral Noble was an agile, clever and popular officer, known for his fastidious dress and cleanliness. But apart from his personal eccentricities, Noble was responsible for much of the victory his command eventually achieved over the German U-boats. In particular, he devoted much effort to improving cooperation between the Royal Navy and Coastal Command of the Royal Air Force, in which he was ably assisted by the then Commander-in-Chief Coastal Command, Air Vice Marshal J.M. Robb. This essential inter-service partnership was enhanced with the transfer of operational control of Coastal Command from the RAF to the Admiralty on the 15th of April 1941. The possibility of transferring Coastal Command bodily to the Navy was considered, but rejected for bureaucratic reasons. In his efforts to improve relations and operational compatibility between the Americans, Canadians and the British, Noble had some success. To enable him to continue with this part of his task, he was relieved as Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches on the 19th of November 1942 and appointed as head of the British Naval Mission in Washington. He was replaced by Admiral Sir Max Horton, who was until then Flag Officer Submarines. Horton, a much more flamboyant figure than Noble, had been handed the blueprint for victory. He looked young for his 60 years and had been a submariner from the beginnings of his naval career. After joining the Royal Navy's submarine service in 1904, he commanded his first boat a year later. He served in submarines throughout the First World War and gained distinction by being the first British submarine commander to sink a German warship. To mark this victory, he introduced the custom of flying the skull and crossbones on return from a successful patrol, a custom still practiced in the Royal Navy today. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Horton was the Vice Admiral in command of the Reserve Fleet and was briefly in command of the Northern Patrol until Churchill appointed him head of the Navy's submarine arm. Once given command of the Western Approaches, Horton became the archetypal poacher-turned-gamekeeper. Horton's reputation for decisive leadership earned him the job, as well as the fact that he had more knowledge of submarine operations than any other officer on the Allied side. As Flag Officer Submarines, most of his effort had been devoted to the running of the Royal Navy's small and widely scattered submarine force. Now he had to turn his talents and enthusiasm to a strategic situation. His abrasive style soon earned him the nickname of Fire Eater among his subordinates. Further down the line, he was described in rather less respectful terms. He could be dealt with in one of two ways, either by complete submission or a resistance based on superior knowledge. But to resist Horton required courage and confidence. Few possessed this, one of them being his intelligence advisor, Commander Roger Wynne, head of the submarine tracking room. After what could be described as a frank exchange of views during which Horton accused Wynne of incompetence, Wynne took Admiral Horton down to the intelligence cell, showed him all the information available, and asked for Horton's advice on how to handle it. Horton, having studied the mass of information for a few minutes, gave in. "Well, I think this is a bit outside my field. It's yours, Roger." This is as close as Horton ever got to conceding a position, and was the basis for a mutual trust between him and Commander Wynne for the rest of the war. Admiral Ernest King was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the United States Navy in December 1941. In March of the following year, he combined this post with that of Chief of Naval Operations, becoming not only the administrative head of the U.S. Navy, but also its operational commander. After the Senate confirmed him in the post for 4 years, he remained in the position for the duration of the war. In some respects, he was a strange choice. King was a true Anglophobe. He detested almost everything British. For Roosevelt to appoint him to a position where close relationships with the British would determine the success of the Atlantic campaign seemed almost deliberately provocative on the president's part. At the high command level, General George Marshall, President Roosevelt's chief of staff, was almost the complete opposite. His regard for the British was high, and his relations with Churchill and most British commanders were good. So, to some extent, Marshall's presence compensated for King's influence. Ernest King was born in Lorain, Ohio, in 1878, and was old enough to have served in the Spanish-American War of 1898. He served in a wide variety of posts and built up experience in gunnery, torpedo boats, mining operations, and submarines. King also commanded ships and squadrons, as was the normal career pattern for senior naval officers at the time. Unlike some of his British colleagues during the Atlantic campaign, he was willing to listen to subordinates and to absorb their ideas, although in doing so he often displayed a rudeness that earned him respect but not affection in the service. King was appointed Chief of the Naval Bureau of Aeronautics in 1933 and was largely responsible for the US Navy's development of naval aviation that was far in advance of anything comparable in the Royal Navy. He rose through the positions of aircraft commander in the battle fleet to commander of the US Navy's patrol force. In this post, he became deeply involved in the US Navy's increasing commitment to the Atlantic and became highly involved personally in the way the battle against the U-boats was being conducted. This may be the cause of his constant interference and involvement in the Atlantic theatre of operations that contrasted with his attitude to the Pacific War. In the Pacific, King chose senior officers he believed he could trust, such as Chester Nimitz, and let them get on with the job. In the Atlantic, King took personal command. Grand Admiral Erich Rieder was Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, from the beginning of the war to his resignation in 1943. He was at the helm for most of the critical period of the Battle of the Atlantic. Rieder had joined the German Navy in 1894, at the age of 18. A native of Hamburg, he'd served in the High Seas Fleet, commanding a cruiser, before his appointment as Chief of Staff to Admiral Hipper, who commanded the battle cruisers at the Battle of Jutland in 1916. Rieder was a committed conservative and German nationalist who strongly believed the Navy could play a pivotal role in restoring Germany's position and greatness during the interwar period. In 1925 he was given command of the Baltic Naval Station, and in 1928 was appointed to the post of Chief of the Naval Command. Under Rieder, the German Navy was transformed. He conceived the so-called pocket battleships, designed to get around the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. He also lay at the heart of the subterfuge that led to Germany having a fully trained and experienced submarine arm, well before the ban on German possession of submarines was revoked. Rieder also masterminded the Z Plan, in which Germany was to build a large, well-equipped fleet based on modern battleships, battlecruisers, and aircraft carriers. Unfortunately for the Germans, the Second World War came 10 years before the plan could reach fruition. Rieder realized that the main role the German Navy could play in the conflict would be the same as in World War I, disrupting enemy trade. The importance of the submarine would be critical. Rieder needed the right man for the job, so Karl Doenitz was made commander of the submarine arm. It was Rieder who urged the German High Command to introduce unrestricted submarine warfare from the beginning of the Second World War. He remembered and had learned how close such a campaign came to success in early 1917. But Hitler equally remembered how the campaign had affected neutral opinion, especially in the United States. Admiral Rieder believed the surface fleet could play an almost equally vital role, and in the early days of the war he sent the few surface warships Germany had into the Atlantic, where they enjoyed limited success. Following the loss of the Bismarck in May 1941, the major surface units of the German Navy were restricted to operations around Norway and in the Baltic. It was his continuing belief in the part the surface warship could play that led to Rieder's downfall. On the 30th of December 1942, a force of German warships, including the pocket battleship Scheer and the heavy cruiser Hipper, sailed from Altenfjord in northern Norway to intercept an Allied convoy bound for Russia. In the ensuing chaos, the German ships were beaten off by a force of British cruisers and destroyers in the Battle of the Barents Sea. This humiliation, which was partly caused by Hitler's lack of resolve on committing surface ships to action, led the Führer to order the scrapping of all the remaining surface ships. Hitler's refusal to countermand this order triggered Rieder's resignation. In an ironic twist, he was replaced as Commander-in-Chief by Karl Doenitz. More than any other leader, Karl Doenitz epitomizes the Battle of the Atlantic. Doenitz was the commander-in-chief of the German submarine force from its formation until his promotion to commander-in-chief of the German Navy in early 1943. Even then, he maintained a firm hand on his beloved U-boats, only surrendering control in name. He achieved even greater notoriety as the second Führer of National Socialist Germany after Hitler's death. It had always been intended that Doenitz should take control of the newly formed U-boat force. At the time of its formation in February 1935, Doenitz was the captain of the cruiser Emden. He was 43 years old. Born near Berlin in 1891, he joined the Imperial Navy as a cadet in 1910, graduating as an officer in 1913. When the First World War broke out, he was signals officer of the cruiser Breslau, which was operating in the Mediterranean at the time. In 1916, Doenitz was appointed to the submarine service. After serving with distinction in U-39, he was given command of UC-25 at the beginning of 1918. His reports spoke of his fine military bearing, energy, good manners, diligence, enthusiasm, popularity, and tact with both officers and men. In late 1918, Doenitz was in command of UB-68. While attacking a British convoy in October, he was forced to scuttle his submarine and surrender. His captors noted that he was sullen and introspective. He became obsessed with the loss of his ship. After undergoing psychological examination in Britain, he was repatriated soon after the armistice, but he immediately rejoined the German Navy. Doenitz survived the post-war purge of naval officers which followed the Kaputsch and decided to stay in the Navy. After 2 years as a torpedo boat commander, Doenitz joined the Torpedo and Mine Inspectorate. After a series of sea and staff jobs, he was promoted steadily until he was considered the most appropriate officer to command the new submarine force. On the 1st of October 1935, he was promoted to full captain and appointed Chief of Submarines. Germany could boast 3 small submarines at the time. He worked closely with Admiral Reeder as the new Navy began to take shape and proposed that Reeder should include 300 submarines in his Z plan. This was the minimum number Doenitz felt would be viable for any forthcoming war with Great Britain. Reeder accepted the figure. At the end of the summer of 1939, Doenitz wrote to Reeder formally expressing his fears over a war with Britain when his force was so unprepared. But he was assured by Hitler himself that no such situation would be allowed to happen. Throughout the war, Doenitz maintained a tight control over his submarines. On the fall of France, he transferred his headquarters to Brittany, where he could be closer to the front line. He was always available to welcome returning crews and maintained a high public relations profile. This was part of his campaign to keep the German people constantly informed of the successes of the U-boats, and thus secure enough resources for the force to keep expanding. This was not always easy. He found himself in constant conflict with the German Navy's biggest enemy, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe. As the war continued, Doenitz constantly developed his concept of operations to reflect the strategic changes taking place. As more U-boats became available, he identified vulnerable areas in the Allied convoy routes and targeted his forces there accordingly. As numbers increased, he introduced the Wolfpack tactics. Although he claimed they were his own invention, he had in fact learned them from his experiences in the First World War. But he certainly enhanced their operations to the point where they almost defeated Allied defensive measures. Yet Doenitz was a realist. He knew that to win the Battle of the Atlantic, his submarines had to sink Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. When in the middle of 1943, he realized that he was losing this battle, he knew that the U-boat campaign was doomed to failure. He did not give up and insisted that more and more resources be allocated to the submarine service. Despite his being the second and last Führer, albeit for only a few days, long enough to sign the German surrender, it was with some reluctance that the Allies put him on trial as a war criminal. The Battle of the Atlantic had mostly been fought within the rules of war, with few breaches of the rules on both sides. However, the sinking of the liner Laconia in September 1942 prompted Doenitz to change the rules concerning aid to survivors. U-boats were not put at risk. The Laconia had been carrying Italian prisoners of war, and a number of U-boats came under attack from Allied aircraft when they were trying to assist the survivors. Following this, Doenitz ordered his commanders not to render assistance and not to pick up survivors, except when they could be of use to the submarine or to Germany. U-boat captains were, in his words, to be severe. Remember, he continued, that in his bombing raids on German cities, the enemy has no regard for women and children. This position was in clear breach of the London Protocol of 1936 and led to Doenitz being charged with war crimes. At Nuremberg, the prosecution said that this meant in practice an order to kill survivors. Doenitz argued that putting the safety of the submarine first was the main responsibility of the commanding officer. One of the witnesses for the defense was the commander-in-chief of the US Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz told the tribunal that American submarines in the Pacific had virtually the same orders as Doenitz had issued. Doenitz was convicted on a much lesser charge and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He died in 1980. On the outbreak of war, the Royal Navy had few ships capable of escorting convoys. The fleet was based upon some 20 major warships deployed around the world, policing the British Empire and the trade routes which maintained that empire. The resources which had gone into developing dedicated, purpose-built anti-submarine escorts for use in the North Atlantic were largely confined to giving destroyers and sloops a rudimentary fit of basic underwater submarine detection equipment and a few depth charge racks. Surface ships could detect submarines underwater by using two methods. Firstly, hydrophones lowered under the water might hear the noises made by U-boats' engines or propellers, but the submarine had to be very close for this to be effective. Today, this is known as passive sonar. Ships were able to detect submarines using crude hydrophones as early as 1918. The more advanced method was to mount an ASDIC transmitter on the bottom of the ship. ASDIC stood for Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, named after a group who looked into the problem in the 1930s. The ASDIC sent out a wave of sound which would rebound off the hull of a submarine. The transmitter then became a receiver which listened for the returning sound wave or echo. This is known today as active sonar. In 1939, the effective ASDIC range was about a mile. By the end of the war, better ASDIC sets were finding submarines well beyond this range. The sinking of the Athenia and other vulnerable merchant ships in the early days of the war caused the Admiralty to examine its position. Even then, the Royal Navy was more concerned about the threat from Germany's few surface ships than it was of submarines, and important convoys were often allocated an old battleship to scare off the Germans. When the convoy system was introduced, its escort might consist of a couple of old First World War destroyers for the last few hundred miles into a British port. Further west than 12 degrees, the convoy would be lucky to have any escort at all. And even if it did, the protection offered by a converted merchant ship with a few old 6-inch guns was minimal. Gradually, efforts were made to address the situation. Existing destroyers and sloops were given an enhanced anti-submarine capability. More suitable merchant ships, particularly large trawlers, were converted to ASW vessels and deployed on coastal work. Following agreements between the United States and Great Britain, 40 obsolete American destroyers were transferred to the Royal Navy, given a quick conversion, and deployed as escorts under the White Ensign. The main task, however, was to find a type of warship dedicated to anti-submarine operations that was cheap, quick, and easy to build in small shipyards, and needed only a small crew to operate it. The answer was in Middlesbrough. Smith's Dock Limited had come up with the idea of such an escort vessel based on their whale catcher Southern Pride. The design was to be a little larger than the whaler, but still small at only just over 1,000 tons. It would need a crew of about 100, had a steam reciprocating engine driving one propeller, which would give it a speed of 16 knots. It carried one 4-inch gun, plus a few smaller anti-aircraft guns, but it had a good ASDIC set and could carry up to 70 depth charges. The Flower-class corvettes, as they became known, were hideous vessels to serve in due to their dreadful seakeeping qualities, but they were ideal for the situation and became immortalized as the fictional corvette Compass Rose in the book and film The Cruel Sea. The Flower class and their successors, the Castles, plugged the gap until something better came along. Once America had joined the war and her massive production capability was working, the Americans lent Britain a number of their destroyer escorts, smaller versions of their destroyers, but better for convoy escort. Britain built her own equivalent, the Hunt class. More importantly, in Britain, the corvette concept was enlarged, given better engines with 2 propellers, increasing the speed to 21 knots, a heavier armament, and a depth charge capacity of 150. Thus, the modern frigate was born. Even so, corvette construction still kept the smaller shipyards busy until the end of the war. Large trawlers and minesweepers were also built, which had a secondary anti-submarine escort role, and older destroyers were converted to escorts as new classes of modern destroyers entered the fleet. By 1942, it was apparent to British and American commanders that the key to success in the Battle of the Atlantic was the aircraft. German U-boats were potent weapons, but they were vulnerable to surprise air attack, either when they were shadowing a convoy or when they were on passage to or from their bases in western France. This became even more crucial when aircraft were equipped with radars that could identify a target many miles away, and when the target could be physically illuminated at night with the use of the Lee light. This was a large searchlight mounted under an aircraft, which could be switched on at the start of an attack. Not only did it give the attacker a better sight of the submarine, it also blinded the crew of the U-boat in the vital moments before they could respond. But the problem was always range. The Atlantic was a huge battlefield, and aircraft of this period did not have the endurance to cover it all. The air gap between Newfoundland, Iceland, and the west coast of Britain was always important, and the closing of the gap with aircraft was pivotal to the outcome of the battle. So an urgent priority was given to the acquisition of suitable aircraft. These could either be deployed from ships within the convoy or from strategically located land bases. It was to this end that the Allies occupied Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroes, but other bases which could have been useful, like the Azores or Ireland, were denied because of their owners' neutrality. Once the bases were found, then suitable aircraft had to be selected. Britain had considerable pre-war experience of the flying boat, and their versatility was useful especially in the early stages of the battle. The short Sunderland and the consolidated Catalina proved especially effective.
Night and day, the Sunderland flying boats patrol far out to eastward, keeping the German coast under constant surveillance for any sign of unwanted activity.
But the ideal long-range maritime patrol aircraft would have to be based on a bomber design. And such aircraft were hard to find, especially as RAF Bomber Command and the US Air Force jealously guarded the aircraft they had. The constant demands of Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris for his strategic bombing campaign over Germany were such that coastal command of the RAF had to be satisfied with those bombers such as the Wellington, whose bombing role had been taken over by the Avro Lancaster. One aircraft, however, was to have a huge impact on this aspect of the campaign. The consolidated B-24 Liberator had a range of over 2,500 miles, and with long-range fuel tanks added, it could remain airborne for up to 18 hours. It was useful as a bomber, which led to a tug-of-war between bomber and coastal commands once the latter appreciated its potential in the war against the U-boat. Those aircraft which were allocated to coastal command soon proved their worth, as they enabled shore-based air cover to be maintained almost all the way across the North Atlantic. To enable some sort of air cover to be maintained out of range of land-based aircraft, the Allies had to rely on aircraft carried by ships. As fleet aircraft carriers were in short supply and were often needed elsewhere, alternative and cheaper ways of providing that cover had to be found. Initially, a number of cargo ships were equipped with catapults that supported one Hurricane fighter. The role of this CAM, or catapult aircraft merchantman, however, was not anti-submarine operations. It was to shoot down the German Condor reconnaissance bomber, which was a significant threat to convoys as they approached the United Kingdom. The CAM ships were also used extensively on the Arctic convoys. Their main disadvantage was that the aircraft could not be reused, as it had to ditch at the end of its sortie. A further development of this was the Merchant Aircraft Carrier, or MAC, that was a bulk carrier, a tanker or grain ship, with a wooden flat deck built along its length above the hull. This deck meant that the MAC could continue to carry its cargo, but could also launch and recover a small number of aircraft, usually swordfish or albacores. These aircraft, although unsuitable for other duties, were ideal for short-range anti-submarine operations. The final development along these lines was the dedicated escort aircraft carrier. These were either built from scratch or converted from existing hulls. Almost all were built in the United States, and they served not only as anti-submarine carriers, but also as support fleet carriers, largely in the Pacific. One of these could provide almost permanent air cover for a convoy, its only serious limitation being the weather. It could carry up to 30 aircraft, including both fighters and anti-submarine aircraft such as the Grumman Avenger. The first German submarines, or U-boats, were based on designs which bore a striking resemblance to the UB-2 type submarines introduced by the Germans near the end of the First World War. The Type 1A was a medium-sized boat of 600 tons, based on a submarine being built for Turkey. Only 2 were constructed, and they were relegated to training duties on the outbreak of hostilities. The Type 2A was a small coastal submarine. Although 6 were built, their part in the war was also very restricted, mainly due to their range of only just over 1,000 miles. The Types 2B, C and D were modifications of this design. Again, their relatively small size of about 300 tons limited their wartime activity considerably. The Battle of the Atlantic was fought by 2 main types of U-boat, the medium-range Type 7 and the long-range Type 9, with production concentrated on these 2. Both had been designed in the mid-1930s, yet were not surpassed until the latter stages of the war. The Type 7 had a displacement of some 700 tons, although later variants reached almost 1,000. They were 220 feet long and equipped with 5 21-inch torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 1 aft. Altogether, they carried 14 torpedoes, or mines. Using their diesel engines on the surface, they boasted a radius of action of some 6,500 miles, although the Type 7C-42 and other later versions could manage almost 10,000 miles. Submerged using batteries, the Type 7 could manage about 80 miles at 4 knots. They carried a crew of 44, and if necessary, could dive to about 650 feet. The Type 9 were somewhat larger, with earlier versions displacing just over 1,000 tons, growing to 1,600 tons with the Type 9D2. Early versions had a radius of over 8,000 miles, growing to 11,000 miles as the design evolved. They could carry up to 22 torpedoes or mines for their 6 torpedo tubes, 4 of which were in the bow and 2 located in the stern. They carried crews of about 55. Both classes could remain submerged for about 24 hours. After that, they would have to surface to recharge their batteries and replace the stale air inside the U-boat. Both types carried a deck gun armament, mainly for use against merchant ships, but later they were used more for self-defense when the submarines were caught on the surface by aircraft. As this possibility became increasingly common, more anti-aircraft guns were added. The larger gun carried on the foredeck was a 3.5-inch on the Type 7 or a 4-inch on the Type 9. A variety of 2 or 3 37mm and 20mm guns constituted the secondary armament. Later in the war, the larger gun was replaced on some boats by additional anti-aircraft guns. To support these classes, special supply submarines were built large enough to carry supplies, enabling the attack U-boats to remain on station longer. Previously, they could only lengthen their patrols by storing food and other supplies in existing living compartments, leaving the conditions on board even more squalid than they were normally. Such milch-cow submarines displaced almost 2,000 tons and could carry up to 432 tons of oil, in addition to food and other supplies. Only 10 were commissioned. By limiting large-scale production of U-boats to the two main designs, the Germans found it difficult to improve performance, whereas British and American boats were constructed in classes built either for a specific purpose or to reflect technical advances. The relatively small size of most U-boats also limited how much additional equipment, like new communication systems or radars, could be fitted. Living conditions on both these classes were poor. The crew had to sleep wherever they could find space, which was often on top of the torpedoes. A crew had to share one toilet. The temperature could be very hot or freezing cold. Air conditioning was non-existent. With little room for food or water, rations were basic, and the crew often went for weeks or months without washing or shaving. After being underwater for hours, the air would become stale, and there was always the possibility of a slow, lingering death or of instantaneous destruction. But by 1943, it was becoming more obvious that these outdated designs would not be able to match new Allied anti-submarine warfare techniques. New concepts had to be found. The first of these was the schnorkel-fitted high-speed submarine with a much greater battery capacity, designed for continuous submerged patrols. Such submarines would be far less vulnerable to the long-range aircraft the Allies were now using to hunt for submarines on the surface. At the same time, the gun armament was to be sacrificed for a much more streamlined hull, with a resulting increase in speed. Over 12 knots could be maintained underwater, a substantial improvement on the 4 knots achieved by the earlier designs. Two types of submarine were to be built using these principles: the Type 21 for long-range deep-sea patrols, and the Type 23 for coastal duties. Their high underwater speeds could only be maintained for short periods before the batteries needed recharging. The answer to this problem was a gas-driven closed turbine, which would be independent of external air. This system had been developed by an engineer called Helmut Walter, who used hydrogen peroxide as the gas. Development was slow, however, and only a few experimental submarines were built. No U-boats using this system ever entered service. On the whole, German submarines were good conventional types, well fitted for their purpose, but the German Navy stayed with the early submarines for too long before incorporating radical technologies. By the time they became available, it was too late. The battle had been lost.